Here with analysis on all of this and much, much more is the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, joins me in studio. And from Manhattan, canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. A lot to get into. The breaking news, as we spoke about earlier, we'll get to the McCarrick scandal in a moment. But overnight, this other bombshell dropped. Pope Francis has authorized a change in church teaching on the death penalty. And he is saying, I'm going to put up the new and the old. Here's an excerpt from the old catechism teaching on the death penalty. And it reads, assuming that the guilty party's identity and responsibility have been fully determined, the traditional teachings of the Church does not exclude recourse to the death penalty. If this is the way to effectively defend human lives against an unjust aggressor. And then at the end it says, the cases in which the execution of the offender is an absolute necessity are very rare, if not practically existent. So the Church was already, and John Paul, sort of tightening the teaching on this and closing it. Here's the new iteration that the Pope approved in May. Recourse to the death penalty on the part of legitimate authority following a fair trial was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good. Today, however, there is an increasing awareness that the dignity of the person is not lost even after the commission of a very serious crime. Consequently, the Church teaches in light of the gospel that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person, and she works with determination for its abolition worldwide. Father Jerry, I want you to talk about this new standard that the Pope seems to be breathing into the teaching about the violation of the person's dignity, the criminal's dignity. Your thought?
Well, Raymond, this is a very troubling action by the Pope because he is directly contradicting the perennial teaching of the Church about the morality of the death penalty, where the new catechism says that it was once considered appropriate. The word appropriate is a euphemism. It was once considered moral, perfectly good, in fact, something that was in accordance with the natural law and with divine revelation. Now, to say, as this new catechism paragraph says, that it violates the dignity of the human person to execute criminals guilty of a serious crime, I have a great difficulty understanding that. We have an ontological dignity as created by God. We have a supernatural dignity as baptized persons. And the dignity of the human being adheres in him. He cannot lose that dignity no matter what other people do to him or even what he does to himself. Now, he can lose the exercise of certain rights through his actions, and that's why we have incarceration and punishment. So to say that the Catholic Church violated the dignity of people until now by saying that it was moral for certain criminals to be executed, I have a great problem in accepting that. I do not believe that the teaching of the Church up to this moment is immoral, and I don't think the Pope has the power to change that teaching. His job as Pope is to preserve and uphold the doctrine of the faith, not to rewrite it. So I'm very, very troubled by this.
Well, the fact is it's been changed, though, Father Murray. What Catholics are looking at this, there's a lot of anger on social media. What do you advise them?
Well, the thing is, Pope John Paul II wanted to restrict its application, but he never said that it was immoral. He never said that this act violated human dignity. Violating human dignity means violating God's law. It means offending God. So what the Pope is saying, if you execute criminals, you are committing an offense against God and his law, because human dignity comes from God. So what I say to people is that this change that the Pope is now putting into the catechism is not in accord with the previous doctrine, and it should be, in fact, changed back to the old teaching. That's the way I look at it.
Robert Royal, is this an ex cathedra teaching from the chair of Peter?
I think we're going to have some canon lawyers and theologians and others dig into this. But for me, the odd thing about this is, why was it necessary to say this? When John Paul II promulgated the idea that it was practically non-existent, the reasons for capital punishment were practically non-existent, That, I think, is about as far as you can go as a pope in talking about this, because this is the responsibility of secular authorities. That there are places in the world, probably in the Western world, you could say that the cases where this becomes necessary are few, but you can't outlaw them. And it's certainly in many parts of the world.
What about Africa, where you get
Africa,
a small village?
Think of Asia, where to keep somebody in a prison at the expense of the population for his entire life is a serious injustice toward people who are very poor, starving, etc. It's not hard to imagine all sorts of circumstances in which you would be balancing off different things, and this is precisely what secular rulers are elected to do, or chosen to do. I don't understand why this was necessary, and it seems to me that to make this an absolute principle, saying that it's inadmissible.
Yeah.
Now, the Pope, as a private person, can say this. As the Pope, when he says this, to answer your question, I think a loyal Catholic wants to pay careful attention to this and give it due consideration. But at the same time, I don't know that this falls within the purview of the Pope, let alone changing previous church teaching, which in itself is already very troubling. It seems to me that this goes beyond his proper authority.
Okay, Father Murray, I'm going to get to you in a moment, but Bob, you raised the question of this really being a first world perspective on the problem, because we have high maximum security prisons, we have wires and cameras and electrified fences. However, even with that, I'm going to point out two things just in the headlines this week. An inmate in Stillwater, Minnesota, he was serving time for a homicide, killed a corrections officer Wednesday afternoon. The first such death of an on-duty Minnesota prison guard. It does happen. And for the sake of the prisoners as well as the populace, and the police officers, sometimes the state coldly, clinically, not out of vengeance, decides it's better for this person to be euthanized, to face the death penalty, capital punishment. Another one, convicted murderer, is a threat in and out of prison. And this is a guy in Illinois. He too, busting out, killing officers. The question is, isn't this a practical consideration? And isn't this why the Church has always been very careful the way it articulated this teaching?
Look, it's an awful thing to kill another human being. But occasionally it has to happen. Police have to do this. People in warfare have to do this. To me, and I'm with all due respect for the Holy Father, I think that this is a rather sentimental approach to what he's calling human dignity. That in fact it is one expression of respecting a person's human dignity, to hold them responsible when they do a terrible thing.
Father Murray, doesn't the Pope have the right, though? He is the supreme lawgiver, the supreme pontiff. Doesn't he have the right to change teaching, to change the catechism?
He has a right to update the catechism, as John Paul II did in issuing a new catechism. The last one had been the Catechism of the Council of Trent. So the Pope can teach, but he can't change the previous teaching. The Pope is there to uphold the doctrine of the faith, not to rewrite it. And, you know, my point here of real contention with the Holy Father's action here is that this is not something that the Church had an opinion on. The Church taught that it was moral for the state as a public authority to carry out execution of certain criminals who were found guilty with certainty of certain crimes. Now, the whole question of punishment becomes under investigation here, let's say.
I was going to ask you
if it's an offense against human dignity to execute a criminal, is it an offense against human dignity for God to damn someone to hell? We say no, absolutely not. If someone is deserving of eternal punishment in hell, then that isn't according to the divine will, and that's a good thing. So lesser forms of punishment, including executions, life imprisonment, imprisonment for a period of time, these are all follow from the fact that punishment issued in a just way is good for both the criminal, for society, and for the authority that is holding justice. So there's a real problem here.
Cardinal Avery Dulles taught that this was actually a merciful act in some cases, because you have very destructive people willing to kill others. They are now incarcerated, and if you let them have a life sentence, they sometimes continue that mindset, that action. But when you know my life is going to end 4 Wednesdays from now, it kind of clarifies the mind and the soul, and you might have a shot at redeeming that person or give them a shot at redemption that otherwise they might not have had the clarity on. I want to ask both of you this. This notion of the evolution of doctrine. In the introductory letter to this change in the Catechism, the Holy Office is saying the Pope sees an evolution of doctrine here. Is this an evolution or a break?
In my view, it's a break, because the Pope has already been making statements about lifetime incarceration, that somehow this does not comport, as Father was just saying, with the idea that all human beings have a chance at redemption. He clearly doesn't like the idea that there can be even eternal punishment. We've had some strange remarks of his about hell in the past, perhaps. I find this to be, to repeat myself, there's a kind of a sentimentality about this, as if there are certain things like people who are serial rapists, serial murderers, that the justice required in those circumstances can somehow be satisfied by simply protecting the community. I don't think that that's true, and I think the entire tradition, there's some very good studies. There's a wonderful book by Joseph Bisset and Edward Feser about just came out in the last year about the death penalty that I think lays out as clearly as it possibly can be laid out what the tradition has been. And I think that they, in that book, have shown that this type of move on the part of a pope or anyone else is a change in what has been settled doctrine, not simply a development.
Wow. So, Father Murray, what does that mean? What does that mean for the faithful Catholic looking in on this? If this isn't a development of doctrine, do you think it's an evolution of doctrine? And what do you make of the notion that society has changed, so we now have to update and change the teaching? That seems to be the mind of the Holy Father. In fact, there's an interview I read with Father Spadaro from several years ago where he makes that argument.
Well, I agree with Bob. This is a break with the tradition. It's not a continuity. In fact, Cardinal Ladaria, in his introductory letter, accompanying letter to this change, claims that this is according to the canons of the Catholic Church, the Vincent of Lerins, that this is a development, not a change. You can't go from saying it is moral for the state to execute certain criminals to saying it is immoral for the state to execute certain criminals. You can't say that that's a development. That's an overthrow, and that's a change. Now, where this leads us, well, it's very worrying. We can't predict the future, but the death penalty has been a constant target of certain intellectuals in the Western world for a long time. Well, there are a lot of other targets they have. Catholic teaching on homosexuality, on artificial contraception, on the illegitimacy of certain Catholic moral teachings, you know, that certain sexual ethics teachings. Are all of those things going to be subject to an evolving societal understanding, you know, new understanding of human dignity? When the Pope says that the capital punishment offends human dignity, I just can't agree with him. As Bob said, if someone is on death row, the greatest dignity they need is to prepare themselves for eternal salvation. And by giving them a time frame and an access to a chaplain and the time to reflect, you're helping them. You know, human dignity also includes everybody else. What about the dignity of the people they murdered?
The victim, yeah.
You know, what is the reaction? Let's say Adolf Hitler had not killed himself in the Führer bunker and he were captured by the Allies. Would it be immoral to execute him? Well, according to this new Catholic teaching of the Pope, it would be. I disagree. We have to have this notion that society has to be defended and that the interests of society include recognizing the gravity of mass murder on a scale of the Nazis. You know, was Pol Pot, was he a subject of human dignity offended if he were executed? Of course not. Everybody recognizes that.
Now, this is a Pope, incidentally, we should make mention, as I heard from Father Jerry there a moment ago, the Pope also opposes indefinite incarceration of people, too. He doesn't like lifetime sentences. So where does this leave the Church in regard to criminal punishments?
Well, I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't even restrict it to that. I think that what we have here is another example of the sort of fudging of a difference between doctrine and a kind of a pastoral approach that is really seems to lead doctrine into the opposite of what it has been in the past. And on this particular issue, it's relatively easy for the Pope to get some support, let's say, from in the nations of the West, where there are relatively few executions in America, Canada, Europe, anyway, as it is. In Europe, it's been illegal for quite a while in most countries. But what this does, I believe, is it sets up an expectation that sort of progressive views of what the church should be teaching are really where the growing end of Catholicism is in our time in the 21st century. To change fundamentally an idea about life and death like this seems to me will have incalculable consequences as a result in all sorts of different areas, as Father was saying earlier. And why it was necessary to do this right now, we could speculate that there are many other things going on in the church, and maybe this was a time to put this out there and maybe change the subject briefly for a while.
Change the narrative,
But I don't see the need for this. For me, where John Paul II went when he said that it was practically non-existent, the circumstances justifying
and all those popes,
punishment
it should be said, Benedict, John Paul, they were advocating for the abolition of the death penalty as well. But they didn't change the church teaching.
Exactly.
It's also hard to change it when the papal states, not too long ago, were hanging people at the Tiber. They had an official executor on staff. I mean, I do find that this is very confusing. We'll work it out in the days ahead.